Okay, welcome everyone to week number 6 of WOOFCODE. This week, for the first time, we'll be talking about React, which is a front-end framework for making our lives easier as developers to create beautiful UIs for our applications. Last week, we talked about adding classes and requesting things from APIs, which was some quite advanced stuff in JavaScript. It's very easy to go quite a long way as a programmer without fully understanding a lot of the stuff that we covered in last lecture. So if things seem to be getting kind of tricky or you're feeling a little lost, then don't worry, you're absolutely not alone. And everything will hopefully come in time with a little bit of practice. So last week's homework, for the bonus homework, if anyone got around to it, we were making a shopping cart, sort of a mock kind of e-commerce site in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And my implementation looks something kind of like this, which is super messy. And I hope that some of you can sort of appreciate just how messy something like this is. Essentially, we had a class of a shopping cart, and that shopping cart had different methods, one for adding a product to our cart, and one for actually updating what was rendered on the screen. And basically, every time we added something new, then this code would run updating everything, and we'd be changing the title, quantity, and price depending on which item in our cart's array of items we were looking at. And in the end, this implementation isn't too far away from how React works, except React makes it a little bit easier for us. So in this lecture, I want to just sort of introduce React and give a little bit of understanding around what the syntax is. There's lots of new syntax to learn with React. And hopefully I can tell you all, convince you all to really believe that React is something that we should get to grips with. So in this lecture, I'm going to be introducing React. We're going to be talking about both functional and class-based components. We'll be talking about JSX, which is the special sort of syntax slash language that we write React in. And I'll be talking about props and state, which are two kind of key components in React that always come up repeatedly right the way to becoming a professional web developer. So first off, I want to kind of introduce what React is. We'll be talking about why we actually want to use React, why we can't just stick with our regular JavaScript and HTML and CSS. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how it works. And then we'll be diving into some syntax, how we accomplish some simple actions in React. And then finally, towards the end of this lecture, I'll be giving a little demo to kind of show you what some of this syntax looks like in practice. So React, I have a few little bullet points here that kind of express a little bit about what React is. It's actually a JavaScript library. So I talked about libraries a little bit in our first lecture when we were discussing different examples of abstraction. So for example, there's a Google Maps library where you can write one line of code and it'll create a Google map on your application. So there's loads of these libraries that sort of bunch together different functionality that we could otherwise write by ourselves. And React is simply just a library that we can use to structure our applications better. It was originally developed by Facebook back in 2013, and it's still maintained quite a lot by Facebook. And the primary purpose of React is creating user interfaces. So creating really nice, pretty applications that we can use. So it's a front-end thing. And a really nice thing about React is that it's great at handling or reacting to user input. Essentially in React, we always have some amount of data that we're trying to display. And typically that data might come from our backend, and we need to display some table of data or some images that we've got from our backend. And React is all about refreshing, re-rendering, updating different parts of the page dependent on what data is being fed in. And this data can also be edited by what the user is doing with your application. So clicking on something could change a store of data, and then that would automatically be refreshed in the page thanks to React. So we've been talking about this framework pretty much through the entire course, where we can separate our applications between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. HTML is like the skeleton, CSS is like the clothes that make people like you, and the JavaScript is sort of the interactive parts under the skin. And you might be thinking, okay, why do we even need something called React? Like, why can't we just use these three building blocks to create our applications? And indeed, we could actually write absolutely everything that we want to create in terms of an application purely in terms of raw JavaScript. When we do this, there's this word called vanilla.js, which is sort of a little bit of a joke because all of these JavaScript libraries like Node.js and React.js always end in JS. So it's a great way to kind of freak some people out by calling just regular JavaScript vanilla.js, like plain JS. Just trying to hack away at everything purely using these element selectors and purely using JavaScript in self-contained JavaScript files. So generally it is possible to write an application purely with HTML files, CSS files, and JavaScript that's editing those files. But generally, we always want to pick a front-end framework to make that task easier. So I have this slide from our first week of the class where we're talking about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This is sort of the stack of technologies that a front-end developer tends to use. And we said, okay, there are these three main libraries to make our lives easier: frameworks for organizing front-end code, Angular, React, and Vue. And in this course, we're going to be talking about React. So why exactly do we need React? Like, why can't we just stick with these three building blocks and do everything by ourselves? So we could do something like this. So we talked about element selectors, we talked about the document object, we talked about DOM manipulation, creating elements. We could have lots of lines of code like this. So we can create a new element, we can add some properties onto the element, we can grab hold of an element on the screen, and we can append this new element onto the element on the screen, and that works. We can then add to that by adding event listeners. We could fetch some of this data from an API. We could create one element per item in an array that we got back from a backend. That's totally possible. But at some point, we're going to end up with something quite messy, like I eventually ended up with in last week's homework. And you can imagine after a while, if we have maybe 20 different JavaScript files that all look something like this, everything hopefully more organized than just one massive index.js file, it very quickly becomes quite hard to deal with and becomes messier and messier. So the main innovation with React, the main thing that's different, is that we can separate our code into smaller subparts. And those subparts we call components. So React is all about fitting these components in with each other. So this example here, we could imagine we have this shopping cart. And instead of writing one JavaScript file that adds each piece of this to this shopping cart, instead we can subdivide the whole concept of a shopping cart into lots of little subcomponents like this. So for example, here we have an example of what this might look like. So for our shopping cart, we could have one component that houses absolutely everything. So a shopping cart component, we can imagine this as like the box around the outside of all of our components. And then inside that shopping cart component, we are creating a search bar. And that search bar, maybe that is even broken down into more components, like a text input and a button and a label, perhaps. And then maybe we have this list component, which sort of sits beneath the search bar. Maybe the list component contains subheadings. So we have this component of a subheading that we can then reuse between different chunks. So we have this chunk here, we can use a subheading here, and then we can also use one down here. And then we also have like this cart item component, which is the name of the thing that we wanted to add to our cart and then the price. So rather than having one big mess of HTML and JavaScript, we can start to sort of compartmentalize everything it is to be a shopping cart into smaller and smaller pieces, which makes it easier to structure and easier to organize. So in terms of why we actually want React, I have a few points here of why it becomes quite unwieldy just to have plain vanilla JavaScript as we create larger and larger applications. One thing is the code becomes a lot easier to organize when it's divided into neat little components like this. Another factor is that our components can be reused. So you could imagine that we make one shopping cart component which has everything that we need. And then rather than having to copy and paste lots of different pieces of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS into a new project, we have this nice component that we can then immediately port over. So it's a lot more reusable. It's also a lot easier to read than plain vanilla JavaScript. You might have had this impression already if you'd been kind of messing around with lots of these DOM manipulation commands. It can be really easy to sort of lose track of what different code is doing. And React has a really simple structure to make it a lot easier to see what's going on in an application, which components are rendering which components, and what an individual component should do. And then finally, a key part of this component landscape is that all of our HTML, JavaScript, and CSS are living in one place, which is a JSX file, which I'll explain what that means in a few slides. So it's a lot easier to kind of navigate around an application like this, knowing that we have this one thing called a component, which contains absolutely everything that we need in order to render that component to the screen. So there's a lot less flicking between different files, saying, okay, I need to look at my index.js file to make this element selector. And then suddenly I need to flip back to a styles page to figure out what CSS should look like. Everything happens in one place with React, which makes things a little easier to work with. So in terms of how React actually works, there's a concept in React called the virtual DOM, which just means that React is sort of tracking what the DOM looks like at any moment in time. And whenever anything changes, so if the user clicks something and that changes the data that should be shown on the screen, React really cleverly figures out exactly which components should be updated. And then it just updates those particular components. So it ends up being really efficient, which is another big advantage to using React. Rather than having to write lots of complex JavaScript ourselves, figuring out, okay, we need to optimize the code so not everything needs to be updated. Maybe if just one component on the screen should change, then React does a lot of this legwork for us and minimizes the amount of updating and code that needs to run as things get re-rendered. Okay, so that's a lot of introductory stuff about React. I want to actually sort of jump in with what this code looks like before giving a demo, just to give a little bit of a feel to how things work. This is a block of React code. So you can see that it's technically JavaScript because this is all wrapped inside of a function. But we're returning HTML. So this sort of style of code, returning HTML within JavaScript, this is called JSX. So I think it sort of stands for JavaScript X. I think this is how it got its name. When we write a file with a JSX extension, we can just inject our HTML directly into our JavaScript, just like this. So in this case, we have a functional component. So the component is literally a function. And we're just spitting out some HTML as a result of that function. And it's pretty much identical to writing regular HTML. The only major difference is that when we want to give something a class name, instead of just saying class equals something, there's this HTML attribute called class, which we can use for our CSS. We instead just need to use class name with a capital N. The reason for this is that class is a reserved word in JavaScript. So we always need to remember just to call it class name instead of class to make things easier. Okay, so I talked about this being a functional component. It turns out there are two different types of components in JavaScript, in React. There are functional components, which is structured just like a function. And then there are class-based components, which are structured just like an ES6 class. So you might remember that with classes, we had a method called constructor, which runs the first time we make a new version of a class. You can think about the analog being sort of like this render method. The render method is what gets called every time a component gets added to the screen, and also anytime that component needs to be updated. So this whole block of JSX is going to get reinterpreted by React if something in this component changed. And that also goes for the functional components. But the difference with the functional components is that everything inside of the return method gets re-rendered every time something changes. So if that seems a little bit uncertain what this means right now, we'll get around to it, especially in the demo. But just realize that everything that's returned in a functional component, either just from the return statement or everything that's returned from the render method of a class-based component, is what ultimately shows up on the screen. So that's like really rough introduction to the syntax behind these two types of components. And with functional components, we can also use arrow functions, which is quite neat. I think this looks slightly nicer than the regular functional component. And we can also cut out the return statement as usual. So everything fits on one line, so we don't need these curly braces, and we can just return the whole block of code that we have in our JSX, just like this. And to actually use a component, we just need to write the name of the component as a regular HTML block. So in this case, we're creating a component called app. And in this case, we have this component called app wrapper, which is a new component, also a functional component. And we can simply inject everything that we have inside of this app component into our app wrapper just by using this name app. So this is just like a custom HTML element that we can create. And by default, these are self-closing. So all this is saying here is take what we have inside of this app component and just throw it in between these two divs, just like this. And the end result is that we get a larger component that contains that code that we had in our app component. And it's easy to make multiple copies of the same component once we have this. Just like with a function, when we can call a function and get the result, then we can call it again, just runs the same code again and again. Adding 3 app components just like this is going to create 3 of the same components that we added in. So this would have 3 of these containers, one after the other, with a header and a paragraph tag in this example. Okay, so that's JSX. That's a really broad introduction to functional components and class-based components. This is sort of the basic usage. A really important concept in React is something called props. Props is short for properties. And props are the things that we pass into functional components and class components in order to render those components to the screen. So you can think about them as being pretty similar to arguments to functions. So we have an example here where we had this, let's say we have a multiply function, and it takes a number called A and it takes a number called B, and it's going to return the output of A times B. So we can imagine this as a black box analogy again. We have this factory that we can put inputs into, and we get back outputs after this return statement. We can see here with this welcome component on the left, this is also a functional component, it's also a function. So it stands to reason that we should be able to give arguments to that function and then get back a different kind of output depending on what those arguments were. So the way that this works is we have this one argument called props that goes into every functional component, and we can use that value inside of our JSX just by encapsulating whatever variable we have in between these curly braces. And then we can pass these props in using this syntax down here. So this example as a whole, we have this app component, which is rendering 3 of these welcome components. And then the welcome component is just saying hello plus whatever the name of the name prop we passed in is. So in this case, we'll have 3 of these H1 elements outputted. The first one will say hello Sarah. The second one will say hello Carl. And then the third one will say hello Edith. So this helps us create components that are more reusable. We can put in different inputs and we can get back different outputs. So this makes things a little bit more adjustable. So yes, we can use this.props property for a class component as well. So we saw how this works for a functional component. The props comes from the argument to the function. And the props is an object with everything that we instantiated it with. And we can also use props for class-based components as well. So just like with a functional component, for a class-based component, we can pass in some values, some properties, and then we can access those values using this.props. Whatever the name of the property is. You might remember from last lecture, we talked about what this is exactly in terms of a class. So this refers to the particular instance of the class that we've created. So it's sort of like this particular instantiation of this component that we've rendered to the screen. So in the previous example, you might say, okay, we're creating 3 different cookies from the same cookie cutter. If we imagine that this was a class-based component. And in the first case, this cookie we're setting with the prop of name to Sarah, and this one to Kahal, for example. Okay, so that's props. That's a really quick introduction to props. You might also see this kind of syntax being used for functional components. It's just nice to flag this. I think this looks a little bit nicer. We're using this destructuring syntax that we introduced last lecture. So we're just saying, okay, get me the name property and get me the age property of this object, which previously we were calling props. And then we can just directly inject these values into anything that we're writing with our JSX, which is quite nice. Okay, so we have these components, we have these we can write HTML inside of our JavaScript basically, which is quite nice. And a really nice thing that this gives us to be able to do is we can do what's called conditional rendering. So since everything that we're writing is in JavaScript, we could have some kind of condition. So let's say that we have this prop, which tells us whether a user's logged in. So this is a Boolean value, either true or false. We could say, okay, if this prop is true, so if the user's logged in, we could render this component, which is a greeting, which maybe we're saying hello to the user's name. We have the user's name on the back end because the user's logged in. We could say hello to that particular user. And if the user isn't logged in, we could instead output some generic greeting of, just hello mystery user, hello guest user. So we can start to add some complexity in terms of doing one thing in one particular circumstance and another thing in another particular circumstance, which is a nice thing that we get with React. And this code ends up looking quite tidy. Okay, so just a few more things that I want to cover in this barrage of new syntax before we dive into some demos. And that's state. So there's 2 differences between functional components and class components in terms of what we can do with them. One of those differences is that a class component can track some data that's tied to a particular instance of a component. So we call this data state, and basically state is just an object that contains some different parameters. And then we can access that state inside of our render method or inside of any other class methods that we're attaching to this class-based component, using the this keyword again. So, okay, this particular cookie that we cut with this particular cookie cutter. There's a value called state that's attached to that already, and that just equals this thing called state that we're initializing at the top here. So here we're just saying, okay, hello, and whatever the name of this, this name property in the state is. And okay, the second part we're going to come to in the next slide, and I'll tag back on it. Another difference that we have with class-based components to functional components is that class-based components have these things called lifecycle methods, which are these special names for methods that mean that these functions get triggered at different parts of the component's lifecycle. So like 3 good examples here are the component did mount lifecycle method, component did update, and component did unmount. So component did mount, this will run some code, whatever code we have inside of these curly brackets, when the element first gets put onto the screen. component did update is going to trigger whenever either the state or the props change. So when we need to re-render the component, we'll be triggering this component did update function. And then component did unmount is whenever that element doesn't need to be on the screen anymore, we'll run the line of code that's inside of these curly braces. So in this example here, we have this component called myComponent. When it first gets added to the screen, we'll get this console log of myComponent just got rendered. When one of the props changes or when something changes with the state, then the render method will get rerun. And after that happens, we'll get this console log of myComponent just got re-rendered. And then finally, if for some reason, because of conditional rendering, for example, if the user went from being not logged in to logged in, so we no longer need the guest component, instead we're going to use the user component. If this was the guest component, then we would get this console log of myComponent just got removed, just as the component's no longer existing on the screen anymore. So this is quite nice to be able to run particular operations, run particular lines of code when different things happen. The most obvious use case is with the component did mount method. You'll often want to do some data loading. So we'll say, okay, the first time this component comes on the screen, I want to make a request from my backend to get some data that we want to fill my component with, for example. So the last thing I want to talk about with these class components, just sort of ferrying back to this page of the state, is that we can then update the state using this method called this.setState. It's really important that we can't simply mutate the state directly. State in React is what's called immutable, which means it just can't be changed. So we'll get some sort of error if we try to directly change the state anywhere except right at the top of the component. But instead we can use the this.setState method, which we can just pass in however many fields on that object that we want to update. So in this case, this component at the start, this will render hello this.state.name, which we're initializing to the name of Adam. So this will say hello Adam. And then once that renders, we'll be running this component did mount method. We're using a set timeout method here. I think we covered this maybe once before. Set timeout is one of these free methods that we get from JavaScript, which says, okay, wait a certain number of seconds and then run whatever's inside of these curly braces. So we're saying, okay, wait 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second, and then run this function. So what should happen here is that the first time this renders, we'll see hello Adam. The component did mount method is going to get triggered. 1 second later, we'll be resetting the state to the name equaling Michael. And then because that state got updated, finally, this render method gets triggered again, and the contents of our H1 are going to update to hello Michael. So that's a really rough introduction to some of the theory behind React. I think it seems more difficult than it really is, just because we need to sort of actually get some practice into like thinking in terms of React, thinking in terms of components, and sort of understanding how this re-rendering happens. But yeah, the nice thing is whenever anything changes, React automatically does the heavy lifting of figuring out, okay, which components in our entire application need to update. So everything sort of seamlessly will update in kind of millisecond time, which is really nice. Okay, so that's a broad introduction of all of the new syntax that we're going to cover in this lecture. The other thing that I want to talk about in this lecture is how we actually get set up with React. And to tell you all about that, we also need to learn a couple of other things about ES6 modules, which allow us to kind of import and export different variables between files. And also, we're going to be talking about Node.js and NPM, which we'll be using to use a package, a library called CreateReactApp, which gives us sort of a really easy jumping off point to get started with a React application. Okay, so up until now, whenever we've included some JavaScript files in our HTML, we've ended up with something that looks like this. So we know that we can use script tags to basically say, okay, grab whichever JavaScript file is at this path, and then just sort of copy and paste all of that JavaScript at the end of our body. And then we know that, okay, the first JavaScript file, that's going to be put there. The second one is going to be put underneath. So the second one, the code in another file.js here is going to have access to the variables that we declare in the earlier file. But that doesn't happen the other way around. So any variables that we declare in another file.js, they're going to be sort of invisible to the code that we're writing in some file.js. So if we're writing vanilla JavaScript like this, if we're splitting our code into different files, we need to be sort of really wary about which variables we're including from where. And especially we need to be wary of the order that we include these JavaScript files. Because it could be the case that if we change a couple of these imports around, if we change a couple of these script tags in order, that could break the entire application, because we could suddenly get a message like some variable that we're calling inside index.js that was first declared inside of yet another.js suddenly isn't available anymore because the index.js code went first all of a sudden. So there's a new feature that came out back in 2015, I think, 2015 or 16, called JavaScript Modules, where we can essentially export any variable using this export syntax. So for example, here we are in some file.js, and we have these two functions. One is called +1, one is called +2, and these functions are either adding 1 or 2 to the value of the number that we pass in. So normally, unless we had included a script file of some file coming before another file, we wouldn't have access to these functions. But instead of doing what we've done before, which is just copy and paste different script tags, inside of a different file, we can use this import syntax to grab these variables into that file's scope. So doing this essentially means that it's as if we just declared these two functions at the top of this other file on the right. And then now we have access to both of these functions inside of this second file. This is important because we use this a lot with React. We can also rename some of these imports using the as syntax. So here instead of having it in our local scope as a function called +1, we can use as to sort of cast that function with another name. Yeah, so this is super important because we're using these absolutely everywhere in React. And it allows us to structure our project a little bit nicer. Okay, next thing I want to talk about as sort of a prerequisite to the demo is something called Node.js, which we touched on, I think, back in week 2, where we first introduced JavaScript. I talked about Node.js as a way for us to write back-end code with JavaScript. So normally with a web browser, whenever we're writing JavaScript code, this is run in sort of like an isolated environment of the web browser. So your JavaScript can touch things that exist inside of your application's files that have been hosted on the website. But your JavaScript can't touch anything which is on your local computer. So for example, your file system, maybe you have lots of spreadsheets, for example. Normally, if you wanted to use some code to sort of go into these spreadsheet files, do some manipulation of those lines of the spreadsheets, make a new file, stuff like this, you'd previously have to use a different language than JavaScript to do that. So one of the popular ones that gets used a lot these days is Python, where you can do something like this. Sort of an older language would be something like C. A new trendier language could be something like Go. There are lots of these languages which are called scripting languages, which you can use to do these sorts of operations on your local file system. But until recently, it was impossible to do that with JavaScript. But there's this newfangled thing called Node.js, which allows JavaScript to do these sorts of operations on your local file system. So to use Node, we first have to talk about the command line, which I've been sort of hiding from you guys so far. The command line is always sort of a scary thing to cover. So I've tried to ignore it for as long as possible. Generally, when we use when we're using computers on a day-to-day level, we usually have something like this to work with. We always have a mouse, and we can click around on things, and we can right-click things, and everything has sort of a visual representation like this. So this is called a graphical user interface, sometimes shortened as GUI. And this is probably how most of you have learned to use computers, particularly if you hadn't really used a computer before the year 2000 or so. But it turns out that we can also navigate our computers in a similar way using something like this on the left, which is called a command line. There's a physical program on your computer somewhere. If you use a Windows machine, it's called command prompt. If you use Mac or Linux, it's called the terminal. And it allows you to do the same sorts of stuff that you could do with a graphical user interface, but instead using typing into this terminal here. So we'll be using Node.js to run particular code on particular files. And particularly, we'll be using a library called CreateReactApp, which will do a lot of the heavy lifting of setting up a React project for us. So to do that, there's something called NPM, which stands for Node Package Manager, which is the sort of central repository of different JavaScript libraries that we can use. And we can use the same import syntax to grab any kind of different code and be able to use it within our computer. So NPM is all about making that process easier and giving us like a local version of all of these files that we're using on our machine. So there's this really nicely put together site called NPM, where you can type in different libraries that you might want to use. And then you always have the numbers for the weekly downloads, and you have some sort of documentation about how to use this particular library, how to include it in your files. And one of those libraries is called CreateReactApp, which I mentioned, which is just a really easy way to get started with React. It's also the way that I would use if I was creating like a production-ready React application. So, you know, all of the projects I'm currently involved in as a full stack developer, I still use CreateReactApp Even on kind of giant projects with huge multinational corporations that are creating huge applications, we still use Create React App to get going. So it's a really popular library and really simplifies the process of getting a React app off the ground and running as quickly as possible. Okay, so I'm going to go through the process of starting a new React app using Create React App. And I want to give sort of an introduction to some different concepts by actually demoing it and going along with you on this. So to start off with, no, I don't want to do that. I think I'm still in the meeting. Okay. So to start off with, I'm loading up my terminal. So I'm on a Mac computer. Wait. So I'm on a Mac computer, but it should be pretty similar. Here we go. Should be pretty similar for a Windows as well. The commands are sometimes a little bit different. So the way to read this is basically make this a little bit bigger. We'll get rid of the top again. Okay. So this is sort of like the sort of the current location that we're at in the file explorer. So this is Adam's MacBook Pro. The wiggle means the home directory. So for me, it's just my name, Adam, is the name of the home directory. I think it's whatever the name of the primary user is, basically, on the Mac. And we have a few commands that we can use to navigate between different files in our file explorer. So a really useful one is cd. So I can type, I have a selection of files for this course. I think I called this WOOFCODE-files. Okay, so we just jumped inside of the folder called WOOFCODE files. Then I can use ls, which stands for list something, list, I think. ls just prints all of the files and folders that are inside of the current directory. Then some other things that are useful is on Mac you can use mkdir, which is make directory. So with this you can create a new folder which is just totally empty. So we can call it new folder. That created a new folder, so we can say ls again, and we'll see that this new folder exists here. We can then change into that new folder, and now we're inside of that new folder now. There's also a command called touch, which is just create an empty file. So we could say touch index.html. Now if we say ls, then inside of this new folder we have this file called index.html. And then the last thing that I use a lot is the code command, which comes with VS Code, which is the text editor that I hugely recommend anyone in this course using. So we can go code and dot, which is like the current directory. Dot always means the current directory. And that opens up VS Code in this particular window. So here's the blank index.html file that we just created. Okay, so there's a lot that you can get really worried about all the stuff you don't know about the terminal or the command line. From my experience, what people tend to do is they really don't understand the command line at all until maybe years into their development career. And you really don't need to understand the command line perfectly to be able to be a good web developer. I think it's one of those things that comes with experience. A lot of the time when you're working with like different things that you might need to get on your computer, like using NPM, what you'll tend to do is just copy and paste lots of different commands that run inside of your terminal. And you trust that one of these eventually works, and you do a little bit of troubleshooting to get everything running. That can be kind of a frustrating process, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. So as always, don't worry if some of this seems a little bit overwhelming. In this week's bonus homework, there will be some some guides to sort of dive into the terminal a little bit more. But as I said, it's not something that you absolutely need to know to be a good developer. Okay, so I'm gonna navigate up a couple of levels in the folder here. So to do that, I can do cd and ... So dot is the current directory, ... is the parent directory of the current directory. So this takes us back to WOOFCODE files. Can run an ls here, and that shows us all of the files and folders inside of that directory. So next I want us to use node. I want us to use npm to get a version of create React app to create a new blank React application on my computer. So whenever you install Node.js, so if you go to the Node.js homepage and click download and install, you automatically get something called the Node Package Manager, npm, installed on your machine. You also get a command called node in this command line interface. So here, for example, I can say node-v, I think, -v. V stands for version. So this command is checking, okay, what is the currently installed version of Node on this computer? And we'll see we get, okay, version 14.15.0. And we also get something called npm installed. So I think I can do this too. Yeah, so npm is the Node Package Manager. This is a website, but it's also something that comes built with Node to help us manage these projects. And this particular version is 6.14.8. Okay, so we have those two things installed. We also have something called npx, which is really similar to npm. It uses the same library of packages. The difference is npx will take a library and sort of execute whatever it can immediately. So we use this to, specifically with create React app, we use npx instead of npm. But you don't really need to know that. All you need to know is the command that you need to copy and paste to create a new React application. So assuming you have Node installed, you should be able to run the following line, which is npx create-react-app. So we're saying, okay, execute this package in the current directory. And I'm going to pass in the name of the project that I want to create. So we'll just call this demo week 6. Okay. So this might take a couple of minutes. What this is doing is it's grabbing npm from, it's grabbing create React app, the package from npm, and then it's running that code on our local machine. And that code is creating lots of new files. We're first creating a new folder called demo week 6. And inside of that folder, we have lots of different files that we'll be needing to run a React application. So React with our JSX that we introduced way at the start, we have code like this. It's sort of like HTML inside of JavaScript. It turns out that our computer doesn't necessarily understand what this looks like. So our web browser doesn't understand, okay, this is JSX, this is how I should read this file. So what create React app does is that it's running something on our computer, which is, I think, called compiler or a transpiler. It's running some special code which basically bundles together all of our React components into a single HTML file, which can then be read by our browser. And then when we're running this server, when we're running this code, whenever we make a change in our React code, that automatically gets refreshed in our browser. Okay, so I want to create a new Chrome window. We'll be needing this. Okay, so that's installed. So to use npm, we can use npm to run these commands. I'm going to use npm. You'll also see this word yarn. So yarn is sort of like a competing package manager, but they all use the same files that we have on npm.org. But here we have this line, okay, we suggest you begin by switching into the directory that we just created and then running this command yarn start. So I'm going to do that first thing. I'll say cd demo week 6. So now we just jumped inside of this newly created directory. I'm going to run an ls command just because it's nice to sort of orient ourselves. And we can see that we got these new files and folders that got created by create React app. And I just want to open this current directory in VS Code. Okay, so there we go. Okay, I'm going to put this onto full screen. I'll just organize it nicely so that we can see our web browser side by side with our code. And I just want to go through all of these files to sort of show you what we get by default when we create a new one of these applications using Create React App. The first file that I want to talk about is this package.json file. So this is something that comes with every single Node application that exists. Whenever we create a new Node project, we have one of these JavaScript object notation files, which basically gives us some configuration for our project. So we can see this object here called Dependencies. Dependencies are all of the libraries that we want to use inside of our project. So we're grabbing React. React is a library we're going to be using. We're grabbing a library called React DOM, which allows us to add a React tree to our web page. And we're using a few other libraries that aren't really that important at the moment. Then something else that's useful in this file is the scripts section. Scripts allows us to run some code using the command npm run and then the name of the script. These are basically aliases for things that we could write by ourselves. So whenever we say npm run start, then our terminal will really run the command npm run react-scripts start. But we get these React scripts commands all through Create React App. So when we run npm run start or npm start, that's going to sort of transpile or compile the code that we have in our React application, and it's going to create this local server where all of this code is going to live. Okay, so that's the package.json file. All of the React code inside of our application lives inside of this src directory. So src stands for source, so it's sort of like the source code of our application. And we can see that we get a few different files to start off with. First off, we have the index.js file. This is like the entry point for our application, the first component that gets rendered. And we're using this function called react-dom.render, which is taking a component that we want to render. So in this case, we have this sort of wrapper component called the react.strict mode, but that's not super important. We can actually just get rid of this. This just gives us some automatic error checking, which makes things a little bit easier. Okay, so all this file is essentially doing is we're importing this component called app from app.js, so current directory /app. We don't need to add the JS extension if we're talking about a JavaScript file, so we can just write it like this. So react-dom.render is grabbing a particular HTML element on the page, and it's just appending or rendering the component that we're giving it, the React component that we're giving it, and inserting it as a child of this element right here. So this is the same element selector that we've been using for the last 3 weeks now. We're basically just grabbing the element with the ID of root, and we can see that element inside of this public folder. So inside of public, there's a file called index.html, and this is the HTML file that everything is eventually going to get rendered to. And we can see down here, there's this blank div called root, and that's pretty much the entire file. Everything else is just kind of window dressing at this point. The only really important thing is this root div. So everything that we write inside of index.js, everything that gets rendered, is all going to be appended to that div with the ID of root at the end of the day. Okay, so that's the index.js file. The one other file that we're really using inside of this project is the app.js file. And this just comes with some simple starter code. This is a functional React component, and we're just rendering some simple HTML to get us started. We're also importing a logo at the top, and we're importing a CSS file. So we can also do this with React. And okay, so that sort of puts everything together. So the entry point for the application, when we run React npm run start, that will render the app component to this, this root ID node in our HTML file. And inside the app component, we just have some dummy starter code that we can use. Okay, so I want to actually see this result on the screen. To do that, we need to run this script inside of our package.json file inside of our terminal. So the terminal, another word for command line, we could run that script here using just npm run start. But it's easier if we do that within VS Code. It turns out that we can create a new terminal window by clicking on this terminal item on the address bar for VS Code. And if we click on this new terminal, then we get this exactly the same command line interface that we had back here, but everything's in one place, and we can sort of see it in line with the rest of our code, which is quite nice. Okay, so inside of this terminal, I'm going to run the command npm start. So I could also say npm run start, but these are sort of aliases to each other, so it's a little bit quicker just to say npm start. So running npm start, this is bundling together all of these, all of the React CSS code, and it's compiling into something that our browser can ultimately read. So here on the right, we have this dummy code, dummy HTML file with some simple styling and this React logo that's spinning around like this. Okay, so at this point, if we use the element inspector, so using the normal Chrome element inspector, we can see everything on the page. We can see this root element that we're using to append everything to the screen. And inside this root element, this just looks like regular JavaScript. So under the hood, Create React App is changing all of this JSX Xcode. So instead of the class name, we have class here, for example. Everything is getting compiled into JavaScript that files can eventually read. And ultimately, we just end up with one long bundled up HTML and CSS document that our page is eventually reading. Okay, so that's a really quick introduction to Create React App, all of the files that we get generated. I want to do a really quick demo that sort of goes over some of the new syntax that we were using so far to explain React. So I want to make a few components. We're going to assume that we're running a blog, and as part of this blog, we have one page where we're displaying all of the blog entries that have been written for that blog. So I want to create an article component, and we're going to create a few different article components that we'll have rendered on the screen. And we'll just do a few examples to sort of bake in how we use React, how everything fits together. So to start off, I just want to get rid of all of this dummy code that we have here. A nice thing with the Create React App server is that we get this sort of hot reloading whenever something changes, which is quite nice. So I want to create a new function component, which is just going to house a blog post. So an article, we'll call it. We'll call it an article component. So to start off with, I'm just going to make it right here. So we'll say function article, and I just want to return some HTML. So let's say we'll have a div, and inside that div we'll have, let's say, an h1, and we'll say, okay, author's name, and then we'll have a paragraph, and we'll just say, okay, here's a description of the article. Let's say description of my article. Article. Okay, great. So here is that. This is a React component. This is a fully fledged working React component. It's simply just a function that returns some JSX. One important thing to note that I didn't mention already, all components in React inside of the render or return method, all components need to be wrapped in an outer component. So if we got rid of these two outer divs here, we can see that we get this error that says, okay, all JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. That's just something to be aware of, but it's quite an easy fix. It's quite easy to see when that's happening. So just undo those two things there. Okay, so here we have an article, which is just an h1 tag and then a paragraph tag with a little bit of data. So inside of this app component, I'm going to create a few instances of this new React component, this new article component that we just created. So this article component is available within local scope because it's in the same file. We've declared the article component right here, so we can use it inside of this app component. I'm just going to say that I want to include one article component like this. And you remember that we have these self-closing tags here that close things by themselves. And already we can see one of these articles is popping up on the screen already. Actually, we've got some weird styling that we get from this CSS file. So I'm gonna delete these two lines at the top, just so we totally blank out on the styling to start off with. And actually, I'll make this an H3. I think that maybe that looks a little better. Okay, author's name. Here's the description of my article. This is one article component, one blog post list component right here. And once we have this reusable piece of code of this article component, turns out that we can just copy and paste as many of these as we like. And this gives us however many article components that we want to create, which is quite nice. Another thing that we can do is add in some props. So remember that we automatically get this object called props with every component. And we can pass in different values for these props. So for example, we could pass in an author's name. So okay, this is by Adam. This one is by Mike. It's quite tedious. This one is by Andy. Okay, we'll just go with 3 for now. So now inside of this props object, we have this property called name, which we can then use inside of our JSX. So if we wrap something in some curly braces, we can then use JavaScript within this function. So we can say props.name will give us Adam, then Mike, then Andy, whatever we're getting from these instances of our functional component down here. So that's quite useful. We could do the same thing with a description if we wanted to as well, but I think that's going to get kind of boring. So that's simply creating a new functional component. Another thing I want to show is importing a functional component from a different file. So by convention, we always capitalize the first name of all of these files in React. And the file is just the name of the component that gets, which we're including from that file, basically. So I'm going to cut that article component here. And I'm going to create a new file called article with a capital A.js. And I'll just paste that in there. And then I just want to export this article at the bottom of this file. So we can do that article like this. Okay, export, export default article. Okay. So inside of our app.js file, we can now say, okay, I want to import article from current directory /article, and we don't need the JS at the end because it's just a JavaScript file. And that works in exactly the same way. So just as when earlier we just had this function article that we could use inside of this app.js file, we're doing exactly the same thing where we can just grab that function from this article.js file. And this just makes it so much easier to read in general, so much more reusable, so much easier to kind of to understand what's going on, which files contain which sorts of code. I'm using this export default thing here. It turns out that we can also just export things. I think the way that we do this with a function is that we can say export function article. The difference using just an export rather than export default is that rather than just giving the name of the thing that we want, instead we have to destructure it using these curly braces. So this time, the thing that we get from /article is an object, and we can grab one particular variable that we're exporting like this. So the upside of this is that we could also export something else. So we could say, okay, export, how do I do this actually? Okay, let's say we want to make a constant of some name which equals Mandy. We could then export name, I think. Export name, this isn't working. Export, it needs to be an object. Export name, yeah, that would work. So then I think we can also use name. Yeah, then we can also grab that constant of name. So then anywhere inside this file, we could then do a console log of this thing called name. And if we look inside of the console, we can see that we get this name of Mandy right here. So sometimes we might want to export more than one thing from a file. But generally for components, we can just use this default because it looks a little bit cleaner, not having to destructure things. So to do that, we're just going to say, okay, export default function article. Okay, so here we are back to square one, just rendering these 3 articles on the screen. As a next step, I want to play around with some of the stuff that we get from class components. So I want to change this functional component into a class-based component. So functional components and class-based components look fairly similar. So it turns out that rather than calling it a function, we just need to call it a class. Then we don't need these curly braces. And then what usually goes directly inside of the return statement for a functional component. For a class-based component, we instead need to give it a render method. And then we can just copy and paste this into here. And this is working in exactly the same way. So the deal with this render method is that when React is adding this component to the screen, so that comes way back in index.js, we're adding this app component onto this root ID'd div. When it first gets rendered, we're running this render method, and we're just outputting that as the content that we're attaching to our HTML document. So much the same way as when we're using a return statement. So now that we have a class-based component, we could do something like add some state onto this class-based component. So state, again, is just an object that's sort of pinned to this particular instance of our application, of our component. And what I want to do is I want to create a counter, which we're then going to update with a button. So I'm going to give this state a property called count, and we're going to start it off at 0. And then I want to have some, I forgot an error here. I think I just need to save the file. Okay, so I figured out why this error is showing up. And the reason is that we've actually made a mistake here. It's not just class app. We need to write class app extends, and then we need to bring in the React library. And the React library has something called component, which is a parent cookie cutter, which gives us lots of things like this render method, for example. Okay, and then we need to load in this React component. So we'll say import React from just React. So when we're adding something that we installed using npm, so in this case, React was a package that we have inside of our dev dependencies, this thing here. So the deal with these dependencies is that when we install our npm project for the first time, we download all of these dependencies inside of this big folder called node modules. And whenever we want to include something from our node modules folder, we don't use the relative path, we just use the name of the package that we want. Okay, so I think this should work now if we refresh the page. Okay, so it's working as expected now. And I should be able to add some state onto this component. So I'm just going to create a property called count, and we'll set it equal to 0. Oh, no, it's an object, so it looks like that. Sorry. Okay, and then I want to create, let's say, an H2 element where we're just going to say the current value is, and we're going to inject that this dot state dot count. Okay, so it's kind of hard to see what's going on here. Count is not defined. Which, yeah, okay, yes. Then we actually just need to save it. Okay, great. So now we have this heading at the top where we're just tracking this count value inside of this, this state object. And this sort of depends on this particular instance of this component. So we could create as many app components as we want, and it would always create a fresh state object, which we can use to pin different things to different components. So the next thing I want to do is create a button. So let's say we'll just use the regular button HTML tag. And we'll just say, okay, click me. Click me is going to be inside that button. So this gives us this button right here. To add an event listener in React, it turns out that all we need to do is pass in a prop called onClick. And this can just equal a function. So I'm just going to use an arrow function here. I'll explain why I'm doing that next lecture. And inside of this function, I just want to update this value of count to be whatever the current value is plus 1. So from early in this lecture, I mentioned that we can't directly mutate state. Don't mutate that state. So we can't say this.state.count equals this.state.count plus 1. Okay, just get rid of this down here. Okay, so this is absolutely not allowed. I think if we refresh the page here and try to click it, it's not updating the state. That's basically what happens. We don't actually get an error here, but this is generally really bad practice to mutate state directly, and it doesn't work. So what we actually need to do is we need to use this method called this.setState. And this.setState will take an object, including the piece of state that we want to change. So we're changing the value of count on the state to the current value of this.state.count plus 1. Okay, so now if we click this button, we see immediately this value gets updated. So that's working as expected. And that is allowed, actually. Okay, so that's the sort of app level state. I just want to make it totally clear that we can also add state for these articles. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into that article.js file. I'm also going to convert this into a class-based component. So to start off with, we'll say import React from React. Oh, okay. And then instead of export default function, we're going to have class article. And this time we need extends React dot component. And then this code is going to go inside of our render method. So the render method is just going to return the HTML, the JSX that we want to put on the screen. We need to use this.props.name instead of props.name because we don't have access to that. And then finally, I just want to export default article. Okay, so this is working as expected, as we had before, exactly the same thing. I also want to create a button on this article component. So we'll give it some state. Again, we'll have a counter. At the end of this P, I'm going to again create another button saying click me. And then we're also going to use another onClick listener. And we're just going to use this.setState. And we're going to change the count piece of state to this.state.count +1. Okay, so again, we have these buttons. So we have this button, which is changing the app components level state. And then we have these ones, which will eventually change the article level state. The last thing I want to do is add in some text down here. So we'll say, make this like an H5 so it's smaller. You clicked this article's button, this.state.count times. Okay, so right at the start, these values are all 0. At the start, we're setting this count piece of state to 0. Whenever we click on this button, then this count gets updated. And the reason why this changes, I should be really clear on this. Whenever the state, or whenever one of the props changes, the whole component gets re-rendered. So this whole render function gets run again just for this particular component. And we can see, okay, we can update this piece of state, and it clicks the, it updates this first article's count value, but that doesn't affect these other values. So what's quite nice about this with React is that we can track an individual component's little bit of data, and we don't need to mess around with, we don't need to track this on sort of like a global level to try and figure out what every little component of our application looks like. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about today is talking about styling in JavaScript, in React. So as I mentioned, all of our HTML and CSS with React belongs inside of our React files. So rather than having to import some script files from our CSS, rather than using that link tags inside of our head of our index.js file, we can simply include our styles directly inside of our React project. So one way of us doing this, which we're going to start off with, is just to create a variable called styles. And this is just going to equal an object, which we're going to then just pass into the style attribute for each of these components on the screen. So just to start off with, I'm going to say, just do something really, really dumb and easy to start off with. I'm going to create a style called background. And this is going to be an object which just sets the background color to red. Okay, and then I can apply this particular style to the sort of container by just using the style attribute. So in much the same way that we were doing last lecture, using the kind of document.element.style. Whatever the name of the property is, we can do exactly the same thing in React. So we now have this variable called styles, and styles has a property called background. So what we did here is just say, okay, all of the styles that we declared in here we're applying to this particular element, which is the background div. We could add some more styles on top of this. So we could say, okay, color should be white. Gives us a text color of white. We could also put in some padding, maybe say 10 pixels. So that's 10 pixels on all 4 sides. So that maybe makes it a little bit nicer, but you can imagine the sort of things that you could eventually sort of stack up. We could have like a huge object here which contains lots of styles, which hopefully makes it a little bit nicer. Okay, so that was like a really quick demo of lots of stuff relating to React. I think probably this is going to seem extremely confusing at this point because I've sort of put so much new stuff on you all at once with React. As always, this stuff becomes a lot clearer with practice. So This homework, we have more exercises from Free Code Camp, as always, to practice that. And in this week's bonus homework, if you want to get stuck in with that, then you can also learn how to do a to-do list app, which is a nice little fun project that will also help you interface with a backend, which should hopefully give a little bit more practice with this. So that's everything for this week. As always, the homework will be due by next lecture. And if there are any questions, clarifications I can answer in the Discord channel, then don't hesitate to reach out